decision when it benefits no one, because those are federal dollars coming down for that program, and we're just deciding we're just not going to spread them around and help children. That's just, I take it personally, and I take offense at it for many different reasons.
When you're willing to send $7,000 per year to a millionaire in Tennessee to pay for a private school, and you're not willing to just pass along federal money to families that can't afford to eat, that shows your values and priorities are not in the right place.
Rep. Clemens, you had some observations about who was in attendance at the voucher signing yesterday. I wonder if you maybe want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty telling that the governor was surrounded by private school students, at his voucher bill signing. If you look at what he alleged that this, the purpose, his alleged purpose for the voucher scam, it seems to be contrary to what everybody saw yesterday in that visual for these private school children. And as we all know, their own fiscal note said 65% of the people who took vouchers would be kids who are already in private school. It's probably closer to 75% based on experts or higher. And so that was pretty telling yesterday. And I know they were reaching out to private schools to try to get children up here. And it just kind of shows how tone deaf this administration really is.
You were talking about food. We just came out of the Republican leadership press conference from the House, asked about the grocery tax and whether this is something leadership will push their weight behind. The speaker essentially said the Democratic version of this bill is dead on arrival. They're not raising taxes to fill any budget holes if it passed. And the Republican proposal, while good, there are issues with it. There's little to no chance that the entire bill at the high rate would be passed, and then only possibly staples would be given some type of tax break, milk, bread, things of that nature.
No frozen pizza.
What's your reaction to hearing that from the Republican side on a bill that probably every Tennessean in the state would support, seeing that grocery tax go away?
Well, I think it's pretty fascinating, and our plan doesn't necessarily increase tax on anyone. It simply collects taxes from corporations that have received multiple handouts. And I think this is a great example of a contrast of priorities. They just passed, a several $100 million bill to allegedly benefit 20,000 children, right? Most of whom are already in private school. When you really load the numbers, you may be down to 3,500 children who are actually currently in public school, who qualify under that high income cap, that are going to go. Now, look at that money compared to the fiscal note on the ending the grocery tax. But also, step back and remember, we had a 3-month freeze on grocery tax. They killed that to pay, that benefited everyone in the state of Tennessee. They ended that 3-month grocery tax and chose to pass, a bill that's going to end up costing $1 billion to benefit about 3,500 children. I mean, I use benefit loosely. So just think about that and what those budgetary priorities are, how they're moving money around from things that benefit everyone and would benefit everyone to things that are just going to benefit a select few, dropping out coupons over Belle Meade to Tiffany's. I mean, essentially, it's really shocking when you think about it.
You ever notice how they start thinking about how we don't actually have enough resources whenever there's a tax cut that might benefit a lot of people? That's when the fiscal responsibility kicks in. These guys have prioritized, instead of helping people who are buying groceries every week, these guys have prioritized a tax cut for people who own stocks, a tax cut for highly paid professionals, and 2 separate tax cuts for that primarily benefit out-of-state corporations. There was not much talk about fiscal irresponsibility then. They just went ahead and did the cuts. But all of a sudden you start talking about things that might actually help people day in, day out, week to week, and then I think you start seeing that sort of talk. I mean, look, this is a case of deeply mismanaged priorities over a number of years, and it's going to start being felt by Tennessee families more and more.
The governor had a lot to say about child care and child care slots on Monday.
He promised to create thousands more with some new proposals, but one of his solutions to that was a $10 million grant to a provider that starts their care at 5 years old. I wondered if you could kind of give your thoughts on that proposal, and then also any ideas to change the availability of slots in Tennessee.
You talked about it earlier.
I mean, I think this is a case of where the governor's talk and the governor's actions just don't line up in any way whatsoever. There's a deep child care problem across the state in community after community, and anyone who has children or grandchildren gets that. Like, there are not enough spots. They are not, that you can't afford them, and we're not seeing the quality that we need. And the governor's investment in, I think it's an $11 million investment in the Boys and Girls Club. One, like, that's like less than big private schools spend on new tennis courts, right? Two, it's not actually aimed at the problem that he talked about. It's aimed at sort of after-school programs, which are an important thing, but is not dealing with the actual child care crisis that people are facing in every community, dealing with newborns, dealing with toddlers, and trying to get back to work. And we're not investing, as far as I can tell, a single dollar into doing anything that's going to increase the number of child care workers in the state, improve their incomes, expand the number of options that are available. And so I would love to see the governor put his money where his mouth is and actually do something about this problem, because it is a huge problem, but people don't need to think that he's addressing it just because he's talking about it.
Yeah, simply mentioning some of the state of the state doesn't mean there's actual meat on the bone on that proposal. In contrast, we've got a piece of legislation this year that addresses the child care deserts to which Senator Yarbrough, because Tennessee has a lot of child care deserts. We actually have a proposal to create a grant program which requires a third of the funding to the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives to spend on facilitating. There's a lot of churches and a lot of nonprofit groups around the state of Tennessee that want to provide child care for children from newborns till their school age, and they just need a little help to do it. And so we've got a bill that requires a third of all money that he appropriates to the Office of Faith-Based and Nonprofit Initiatives to go into that, to help address that, and it prioritizes child care deserts. So it's not just thrown around. It's saying if there's a need, let's help fill it. And if nobody really knows how they're spending the money over there in that office right now anyway, we've requested it. And so I thought I was being conservative and said, all right, a third of it has to go to this, so we at least know how it's being spent, and it's being spent on a good purpose. Because, like I said, a lot of churches and nonprofits have the capacity. They want to provide these services, not only for their members, but their community, and they're generally safe environments, and they can be licensed. So, I mean, that is a tangible plan to solve this problem, in direct contrast to the governor's that is nothing but fiction at this moment.
In addition to the funding that you mentioned, one struggle that some of the smaller, or maybe not yet licensed or potentially working toward being licensed providers like mom stay out programs face are strict limitations on the number of hours and the licensing requirement for some of those providers. The governor mentioned, I think there was one line in the speech about potentially looking at some of the regulatory burdens. I know that's an existing conversation already in the legislature. Would you all be open to changing some of those regulatory?
I mean, absolutely. Like, we have been pushing for those same regulatory changes for years. I mean, like, that is something that we have been working with colleagues across the aisle, but pushing legislation to dismantle some of those regulatory barriers that stop new child care centers from opening, and to facilitate them working together to avoid some of the conflicts that they come into. I mean, we need, lots of times the government isn't helping, it's getting in the way, and we should get out of the way, but that doesn't mean that we should invest less. I mean, this is a place where this is a priority. It's a priority for our economic development. It's a priority for our families, and it should be something that we actually make a priority in state government instead of just giving it lip service.
I understand might be some sort of quirk in the voucher, part of the voucher bill for the hold harmless provision, where if you don't get the hold harmless money the first year, in subsequent years you might not be eligible for that. Do you know anything about that, or? You have anything to say?
I mean, so the language on first, we should stop saying hold harmless, because it does not hold anyone harmless. Whatever this provision is, it was changed numerous times during the course of the process. There was a lot of disagreement about what it meant, and I think there's a lot of difficulty in understanding how it's going to apply in the first year and how it's going to apply in years after that. And so, I mean, I think that they're looking at very particular language in that, and I think that if people don't hold their legislators to account, they are going to see big deal losses in their public school funding every year, and they're going to face a need to increase local property taxes very soon. Well, that's just period. Like, that's going to happen either way. But I mean, look, I think the hold harmless probably does have a few like technical glitches, but the bigger issue is that that provision probably won't apply to anybody anyway. It's designed in a way that it's not going to be triggered. So like getting to the weird exceptions you're talking about probably isn't going to be that big of an issue either. And so, I mean, I just think you're going to see massive losses to communities over time.
Linda McMahon is testifying right now, and President Trump keeps saying that he wants to delete the Department of Education to send education back to the states. Is education not in the states?
Well, I'll just point out that this whole notion of eliminating the Department of Education is it's a much bigger issue than what they're talking about. And if you look at the history of the Department of Education, the Department of Education is responsible for ensuring educational opportunity across all the states, to make sure that states who actually pass and enforce their own laws, a lot of the laws you hear them complain about and policies are actually state law that mirror federal law. But the reality is that the Department of Education ultimately enforces and oversees states' education programs in compliance with the U.S. Congress and carries out U.S. congressional laws and policies. And so if they really were serious, not just, again, lip service, or serious about these addressing or reversing these policies with which they apparently take issue, that conversation belongs in the U.S. Congress, and they control Congress, both houses, just like they do up here. And so we'll see if Congress actually decides that they're going to roll back all those laws that they apparently take issue with, like IDEA and those types of things, that the Department of Education is charged with supervising at the state level. There's a fundamental misunderstanding and mischaracterization of the role of the Department of Education, and it's there for a very serious and important purpose. And we'll see what they decide to do in Congress, because that's the only place they can really take action, not just in the executive department.
So the next time you hear the talking point that we should send education back to the states, what you should do is go talk to someone who had a sibling or a relative who was disabled in a state like Tennessee in the 1960s, where those children were far less likely to go to school, to ever learn to read, and the loss, the human loss, the economic potential loss from that type of activity, which is you had a budget constraint, and the state chose not to invest in people who were vulnerable and whose education might cost more until the federal government stepped in. And so, I'd love to say that we're in a position that wouldn't happen in Tennessee, but let's be clear, what we would have to do is we'd have to create the apparatus here to ensure that we actually meet those standards. We'd have to see a different investment in Tennessee to ensure that we're actually taking care of special ed kids across the state of Tennessee. We would see decreased funding into high poverty schools in Tennessee, which we're already seeing on the state level, but that would just be magnified by the federal government sending it here. And if you want to trust, look, I would love to say trust the Tennessee legislature, but you can't. Like, you can just look at the data over the last several years. Like, in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, you saw year over year huge investment growth in public education. And frankly, huge gains in what students learn over that same time period. For the last decade and a half, you have seen education funding largely flat in the state. It has barely kept up with inflation. It has fallen far below the national average. And that is not the people that I think we want to provide more and more control over the future of education in the state.
Yeah, I mean, just look recently. If you think worried about the state of Tennessee protecting special needs students or vulnerable children, look at the voucher bill. Who's cut out of that? Expressly cut out of any protections. And we even had a bipartisan amendment to prevent discrimination of those children. And it was killed along party lines. So you don't need to look back very far to know whether or not they would do the right thing.
We learned this week that there are 233 open positions in the Tennessee Highway Patrol, and Governor Lee proposed another 100 positions. But Senator Bo Watson just said, we could see that number lower of, the available positions when the next class graduates. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, it's just kind of moving ships around. There's 100 more THP, I think, or troopers in this budget, 22 more TBI positions. I don't remember the exact line item of that cost, but if it's necessary to keep our community safe, then that's a conversation we'll have. But again, there's a lot of ways we can invest money to directly benefit every family across the state of Tennessee, and we continue to see certain things being cherry-picked for certain reasons and not invested into families. And whether this falls in that category or not, we'll have that conversation.
Well, and here's the thing. If we have 233 open positions, we should probably fill them. And I have questions about whether we actually will have the capacity to fill all those empty positions and 60 new ones. And so I'm curious whether this is an actual commitment or is a talking point for a speech as opposed to something real. And so, I think that's really the question that we're going to have to get at during the budget process.
Anybody else?
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys.